Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Atreyu Crochet. So, as promised, today I'm going to be showing you continuous rounds. Now, I thought that it would be a good idea to just continue working with the circle that we made in last week's video when I showed you 2 to 3 different ways to crochet in rounds. Because we're gonna go immediately from this way using this same swatch to doing continuous rounds. So I thought the best way to show you the difference is by crocheting using the same swatch so that you can clearly see the delineation between crocheting in rounds this way and crocheting in continuous rounds. I have my 100% black Irish breakfast tea so I'm ready. If you don't have this, then check out last week's video, crochet this, and then come back to this video and just pick up where we're starting today. In last week's video I also told you that you would need a stitch marker, and so this is the stitch marker that I'm going to be using today. If you don't have a stitch marker, you can use a safety pin, a paper clip, a yarn of a different color. You don't necessarily have to have this exact stitch marker. Just something to mark the stitch. That's the purpose of a stitch marker, and you're gonna always need that when you're crocheting in continuous rounds because you won't have that eyesore of that chain 3 sticking out telling you, where the beginning and end is of a round. Okay, so let's get started. Alright, so this was the last round that I completed last week, and I'm going to slip stitch into that third chain up, 1, 2, 3. And remember to slip stitch, you enter the stitch, yarn over, and pull all the way through. That will be the last time that I'm going to slip stitch. So say at this point we're no longer doing any increase rounds. We're just putting 1 stitch in every stitch around. Well, I'm in the chain 3, and that chain 3 does count as a stitch for this round. So let's say I want to make half double crochets. Okay, so I'm going to enter that same place where I slip stitched, but remember I have to yarn over first since it's a half double crochet. Enter the stitch, yarn over, pull through to the front, and I have 3 loops just like the double crochet. But now I yarn over, and instead of going through 2, I go through all 3. Okay, now I'll go to the next stitch, which is here. Remember we put the half double crochet in that chain 3, and so this is the next stitch. We yarn over, enter the top, slice the icing off the top of the cake. That's what I always like to say. Yarn over, pull through to the front, 3 loops, yarn over, go through all 3. Alright, before we get too far, I'm going to go back to this first half double crochet we made, and that's where I'm going to place my stitch marker. So you can wrap it around the stitch, you can go through part of the stitch like that, and just clip it on. Once again, if you don't have a stitch marker, then you can use a paper clip or a safety pin or yarn of a different color. Okay, like that. Now we know that when we get back to this stitch that this stitch marker is hanging off of, we know that that's the beginning of the new round. So I'm just going to continue going into stitches, putting 1 half double crochet around in every stitch, and I will meet you once I get back to that stitch marker. Okay, see you there. Alright, so as you can see, we've put our half double crochet into the last double crochet of the previous round, and now that chain 3 is the next stitch, right? See, this half double crochet is in that double crochet, and then there's the chain 3. Remember, we put our first half double crochet into the top of that chain 3, so that means that this is the beginning of the round. Also, the stitch marker, that was the purpose of the stitch marker. It's also telling you that this is the beginning, this next stitch is the beginning of the next round. So normally, like in last week's video, we would slip stitch and then chain, but because we're doing continuous rounds, we will do neither of those two things. Instead, what we're going to do is yarn over, go into the top of that half double crochet like that, yarn over, pull through to the front, okay? 3 loops, yarn over, go through all 3. And then go to the next stitch and just continue making half double crochets. Yarn over, go through all 3. For anyone that is still unclear about how to make a half double crochet, you yarn over into the stitch, slice the icing off of the cake, yarn over, pull through to the front, 3 loops, yarn over, go through all 3. Okay? Now, you would take this stitch marker off of that stitch and put it on the stitch that you just crocheted into for the current round. So you could do that, and then you know that this stitch right there, get this clearer for you, this stitch is in that stitch which had the stitch marker, so this is now the first stitch of the current round, and that's where we're going to place our stitch marker. At some point you'll get used to knowing how to follow, what the first stitch is by going back to where you originally put the stitch marker, but because you guys are beginning, we'll do it like this. Every time you get back around and you crochet into that very first stitch of the current round, you'll remove the stitch marker from the round below and put it in that first stitch, just to help you keep track, okay? And then you just continue on as normal, putting half double crochets into every stitch around. So continue with that, and I will once again meet you once we get back around to the stitch marker. Alright, so once again we are back around to the stitch marker. So we put a half double crochet in the last half double crochet of the previous round, and now the next stitch, which is there, is the one with the stitch marker. So let's say with this round we wanted to, instead of making half double crochets, make single crochets. Are we able to do that with this continuous rounds method? Well, in short, yes, you are able to do that. So in this next stitch, instead of making a half double crochet, we would just make a single crochet. And the way you make a single crochet is just without yarning over first, just enter the top of the stitch, slice the icing off the cake, yarn over, pull through to the front, 2 loops, yarn over, go through both loops, 2. And now take off the stitch marker and relocate it to the stitch, the single crochet that you just made, so that you know that when you get back around to it, that's where the round begins. That's the first stitch of that round. And then you just continue making single crochets around and around. I will meet you once we get back to the stitch marker. See you there. Alrighty, I'm back around to the stitch marker, so I'm just going to continue making single crochets just because I want to. I just want to show you something. And obviously, if I was going to finish this round, I would have taken that stitch marker off and put it on that very first single crochet for this round, but I'm not. I just want to show you guys something. So let me take the stitch marker out right now so that I can emphasize the difference in terms of how your project looks when you crochet in continuous rounds versus when you crochet in non-continuous rounds where you're using the chain 3. So going back to what we did last week, you see that you can always spot that chain 3 from the very first one in round 1. There's the chain 3, round 2, chain 3, round 3, chain 3, round 4, chain 3. But then here is where we started round 5, 6, 7, and 8, and you see you can't really tell whatsoever where the beginning and the end is. See, this area looks like this area, okay? And that's the benefit, you guys, of crocheting in continuous rounds. you don't have that seam. The seam just kind of disappears. Now, I knew from when I made my first half double crochet there, and let me put my stitch marker back there just to show you. Once you get a little bit more advanced, you'll be able to leave your stitch marker there and then just follow the stitches with each round, and you'll know where the new round begins. But I would say definitely starting out, it's always a good idea that once you get back around to the stitch marker, you put your first stitch into the stitch that the stitch marker is in, take the stitch marker out, and put it into that first stitch of the current round, okay? But it'd be easy enough for me to follow to figure out where the first stitch is of, later rounds, because you just look at what stitch is in that stitch. So this stitch right there is in that one, so that means that's the first stitch of that round. This stitch right there is in that one, so that means that's the first stitch of that round. This stitch right there is in that one, so that means that's the first stitch of that round, okay? So you're going to notice that as you continue to crochet, your first stitch is going to start to kind of drift to your right, okay? But it doesn't matter because you're crocheting in continuous rounds, so you won't be able to see a seam anyway, okay? So hopefully last week's video has given you some ideas, just a basic idea how to crochet in rounds. Hopefully today's video has shown you how to crochet in continuous rounds, and pretty soon you guys will be making another tam using the continuous rounds method. That is going to be it for today's video. I'll see you in the next one. In the meantime, happy crocheting.